All right, good morning. It is COMP3025 in the winter 2017 semester, and we are week 5, part 1 of our broadcast here at Georgian. That's mobile and pervasive computing. So last night, your first assignment was due, right? So you should have all that done and handed in, right? Everyone? It was, yeah.
What was due last night?
Assignment 1.
Calculator?
Yep.
Wasn't that last week?
Nope. Week 4, right?
Submitted it.
Last week. And last night you had nothing due because we were talking about TypeScript last week. And this week we're talking about Angular. I'm glad you guys are all awake. We're talking about Angular this week. So last week was TypeScript, this week was Angular. And I was going to give you assignment number 2 today. Let's take a look at Angular a little bit. So Ionic is the new Ionic 2 is kind of a mix of TypeScript and Angular, and as well as Ionic. And we talked a little bit about how Ionic, or even jQuery Mobile, is a framework that you kind of apply, and then you get some basic templates to start with, right? Which is pretty cool. So, but what I want to try and look at right away is what makes up this framework and what you need, what tools, if you will, or how we build up to this thing. So how do we build up to it? Well, we've already did it last week. We talked about TypeScript, just as a review. So here's TypeScript. And we did a bit of an example of a game that we were kind of starting to make. And we did it with classes, and we're going to need some of that same organizational structure when it comes to classes and object orientation, if you will, as when we start looking at Angular and Ionic. Let's take a look at Angular itself. So here's Angular. And it says, try the new Angular, like as if it's new anymore. It's been around for a little bit, but Angular 1 is still in use. And the reason why Angular 1 and Angular 2 are still up and running here like this is, one, backwards compatibility is not possible with Angular 2. If you use Angular 2 and Angular 1 projects are completely different, you can't backstep. It's almost like you're learning a whole new thing. We talked about Angular 2 in COMP3025, Advanced Web Programming, Angular 1 and Angular 2, saying, I kind of cited in the last iteration of the course that Angular 2 is just coming out. I didn't feel it was really that stable at the time. And, there's a lot of shims and a bunch of stuff to fix things. That was Angular 2 at the time. It's not much different now in terms of shims. All they've done is they've packaged them together to create an easier way for developers to get started, right? So let's get started. Let's follow the get starting pattern here. So one of the things they talk about with Angular 2, again, I could look at the books as well, and we're going to look at this, is the idea that we're going to use the import statement from TypeScript. This is ES6, ECMAScript 2015, if you will, where we use the import statement to import from a particular library or module, right, components. And the word component itself, the class component, is something that we're going to be doing a lot with Angular 2. Angular 2 uses components. They kind of replace directives. In fact, if anything, components are mini directives. If you guys remember directives from Angular 1. Directives are little pieces of logic, right, that kind of give us front-end flexibility and the ability for us to use JavaScript in the front end to do a lot of things before we get to any kind of back-end whatsoever. Angular 2 makes it easier for us to deal with things up front a lot quicker. The idea that even Angular itself had two-way data binding, where it would kind of connect with the back-end and give us information right away through this kind of somewhat similar to an AJAX call, which is what traditionally we would use, is still highly being used today. So here's a great example of starting a component. So here's app.component.ts, and notice that they put it inside this app folder. So when we set up our folders, if I was going to set up an Angular project, I would definitely have, if going with the best practices here, an app folder. Okay, inside the app folder, I would have app.component.ts. Last week we talked about TS meaning TypeScript, right? So this is as an example of this. When we load a component from this Angular 2 core library, component is a decorator. This is what this is called. Anytime you see an @ sign, it's a decorator. And inside the decorator, notice that we're passing in an object. Here's the object. Now the decorator takes at least two different properties here when Angular 2. One of them is the selector, all right? And the selector property, what it does is it ties into the index.html that is being used with Angular, almost the main manifest for Angular 2. So let's suppose we have an index.html and we want to use this selector. We have to make this custom selector called my-app. In fact, the convention that they've talked about in ECMAScripts 2016 for any kind of decorator or component logic suggests that all selectors that are custom selectors made by Angular 2 in like frameworks should all have a dash inside of them. I'm just going to leave that out to you. So in the future, when we see this, the spec, if you will, for decorators, custom decorators, should have my dash or something dash and something else. Okay, it's got to have this kind of framework format to it. Well, that's what they suggest. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, but that's just the best practice. Okay, that's number one. Second, template. All right, so that's the second thing that they have. So these are the two minimal properties you need to pass into the component object. That's what this is. This thing, the component class, the component decorator, right? And why is it called a decorator? Because this syntax decorates this class declaration, right? So here's the class declaration. Notice we have a class keyword and the name app component, right? As an example, well, what we're doing here is a couple things. So once we put this decorator and it's what we're passing into the decorator's constructor right on top of the class, then this component, this decorator, suggests that it is linked to this class. This decorator modifies this class. This decorator filters this class. Call it what you like, all right? Same idea that we use when we do C# and we do any kind of attributes, custom attributes in C#. If you ever did that, it's the same thing. We have some kind of custom attribute on top and then the class right below it. Whether we do with C# or whether we use Unity, and by the way, we'll talk about Unity a little bit today as well, because one of the challenges that you'll be having is for your final project, what are you going to do? Are you going to use an Android? Are you going to build an Android project? You're going to do an iOS project for a utility app? Are you going to build a game, right? And if you're going to build a game, because we're talking about cross-platform, building and hybrid app development here in this course this semester. Why not use Unity or Unreal? And if you guys are taking Unreal, which is I think you guys are, you guys are doing a little game course to make a mobile game. All right, not a game for a console or PC or whatever or desktop, but for mobile. That's a totally different user story than what you're doing. Here's a great, and just to kind of go off on that tangent for a second. One of the challenges, people love to make 3D games, whatever, for mobile, but how effective really are 3D games for mobile, right? Truly, nowadays. Not very many of them are really successful, except for maybe, the endless runners, Subway Surfer comes to mind, right? It's not truly, 3D. Well, it is, but it's not really 3D like, first-person shooter or something like that. Because for a first-person shooter, you need look, right? For the device, you need to kind of look up and down, look all around. And that means you need to kind of have a phantom control or some kind of phantom stick that's hanging out on your mobile device, right? And because you're trying to mimic, because that's what we know how to do, we want to mimic the controller. And then there's got to be a way of going forward and back, left and right, kind of moving all. And so you have these two phantom sticks. But is that the right user story for a mobile device, right? And I think it's not. And the reason why we do it is because we don't know any better, right? We haven't programmed 3D games very often on a mobile device. Maybe what we should be doing is using the accelerometer, right? But then that's weird because if you kind of tilt the mobile device, and you kind of lose aspect, right? So that's kind of weird too. And it's not like your mobile device, when you tilt it, is going to change your perspective. You'll lose perspective, actually. It'll look weird. You'll kind of, so from the user's experience, making something like a 3D game right now is not recommended. I recommend a 2D game if you're going to go with a game for your final project, something that's straightforward, that you can kind of bang out. But it works on both Android and iOS. If you make a game, that's going to be the requirement. So testing on both devices, right? And the reason for that is because you're going to be using Unity or Unreal, right? And chances are it's going to be a lot easier for you to make a game with Unity or Unreal than for somebody to program a utility app with Android, iOS, or with Ionic. Much harder to do it that way. Okay, although games are hard anyway. All right, so going back to this is the component structure. You're going to see this over and over again in Angular, and you're going to see this in Ionic. Whenever we use an Angular 2 in Ionic, it's going to look something like this. Notice that the template structure, we have a, when I say template, here's the HTML that gets injected into the area inside of your index.html that has my-app, this custom selector, right? So you make custom selector, and this stuff gets injected. Now, this is contrary to what we said before. Remember old Angular 1? They were like, no, we don't want to do kind of HTML injection. It's bad. And then React came out. And React does it all the time. It does kind of injecting HTML and content, which is kind of messed up, right? If you think about it. One thing to note is Angular 2 takes advantage of the backtick, the ECMAScript 2016 backtick, right? Notice that it has that. So you have this backtick right here. And the reason why we use backticks is it allows JavaScript to create, kind of a string that spans multiple lines. Because previously, JavaScript cannot span multiple lines of a string properly. You get errors, right? But if you use a backtick, right, especially when it comes to some kind of property like this, if you try to do this with regular single quotes or double quotes, it would give you an error. But if you use backtick, it works, right? So that's the new thing that they included. And backtick, again, is found just under your escape key on your keyboard, alongside your tilde, your tilde symbol. All right, so that's what this is. Okay, here's your index.html. Here's a great example of what they do. So again, we call this custom directive my-app, my-app. And here's my-app on the index.html, and then it says specifically inside the body. And then what we put in there is some kind of placeholder text. It says loading app component content here, right? And what this is doing is, in effect, right, it's a placeholder. So if you see only this loading app component content here, something's gone wrong with your application, right? What you're supposed to see is hello, whoever your name is, right? Notice that they also pass the name, in this particular case, the name property, right? It's by default, JavaScript makes it public because this is part of the class app component, right? You have a property called name, right? Name, and you're assigning a variable or a literal, sorry, called Angular, right, into name. Therefore, name is by inference a string, right? And you can access it, sorry, right inside of Angular's template by using the double curly brace, or what we like to call in Angular a mustache, right? Mustache notation, right? So these kind of two double mustaches on each end, right? And these double mustaches, anything that's in here in terms of a property, gets injected or interpolates the data, which in this particular case is a string literal, inside of this string itself. So this template, spits out hello Angular, and that's what will go in here when we make the app happen. Now I'm telling you all this stuff, and you're like, why don't we just get to Ionic, Tom? Yeah, well, if I don't tell it to you this way, when we get to Ionic, then I'm going to have to make a way bigger explanation of what's happening. Might as well talk to you about it here at Angular. All right, they talked about TypeScript a little bit here. The next step is they say start learning Angular. And if you notice, it says there is a whole setup for local Angular development. Let's walk through this thing together, because I need you to understand the challenges in setting this stuff up. Now, luckily, Ionic does a lot of this setup for us. When we get back to Ionic, a lot of this, all the shims and everything else gets set up. It's all beautiful, right? But here, I want you guys to step through this with me so you understand the pain that's involved, because today it's Angular Day, right? Angular 2 Day. One day we can focus on this one technology, and then we're going to give it a glancing blow and move on next week to Ionic full blown. By the way, next week is week 6, and the week after that, we'll have a midterm exam. And what is the midterm exam going to be on? TypeScript, right? We talked about that. There's going to be some questions around that. I'm going to try and make it in terms of getting you to build something very small. You might have some kind of a small app to build based on the things that we've talked about and the assignment that you've been given, plus assignment number 2. That's number 1. You'll be given an app to build, and or a combination of multiple choice true false questions that are code related, right? So it's not going to be like So why would you use TypeScript? How come Angular? No. It'll be like, okay, what does this code do? You know, that more of like that kind of question. If we do any kind of multiple choice true false, we'll see how it goes. I'll give you guys a review next week of all the things I'm covering on the exam, and it'll be all the things we've covered here in lecture, as well as the materials I put up on Blackboard, SUZR, as well as the videos that I've talked about, things we've talked about on the videos. All right, so here we go. We're going to hit setup, and setting up local environment takes a little bit of time. And notice what it says. It says setting up a new project in your machine is quick and easy. I'm going to kind of highlight these words, quick and easy. Yeah. Let's try it out. Please do this with me. I really encourage you to try this out. With the quick start seed, yes, it is. And it's maintained on GitHub. Maintained on GitHub. I love you, Angular 2. Let's go to GitHub and see how this works. Okay, so here's the quick start seed, right? Now, wow, there's a lot of stuff in here, right? Here's my source folder. And in my source folder, I have an app folder. And in my app folder, I have a couple of components. One of them is app module, and we're going to take a look at this. App module starts off a couple things. We also have in Angular 2, just like we had in Angular 1, something called dependency injection. And what dependency injection, what we do is when we have our browser module, here's our browser module, we need these two pieces. So we need to import ng module from Angular Core and from our platform browser. And then we import that app component we just talked about by using this, again, the whole loading framework with the import statement from our local folder. The / means local to this same folder is app component.ts. We just don't have to put the ts in there. An app component we defined just earlier, right, on the website, that little injection piece. Notice here how we do. We import our browser module, those imports. Declarations are all the components that we're adding in. Right now, we only have one app component. And bootstrapping, we're bootstrapping app components. That's the start module. App component is our start method, if you will, or starting class. That's how it works, right? And then we're exporting our app module. We're exporting this. And then if we go back to app component for a second, here's app component. We're importing the component like we did last time. This is being imported into app module. And there's app component.spec.ts. And what does this do? Here's app component. This is the bootstrap module that we're getting from app component, right? Which is the main one, right? Notice it's not app module, right? App module is our starter. It's almost like our driver class is app module, all right? It drives the entire program. Here, what we're doing is we're importing a component fixture, test bed from Angular core testing. We don't really need to do this. This is, just for testing framework where that uses asynchronous testing. And import by by from Angular platform browser, right? And debug element. All this stuff right here, I'll tell you right now, is optional. You don't have to do any of this stuff. Describe, notice this is a test. That's what this thing is. Describe app component function, right? And we're using this idea of you're doing a test. That's what this thing is, right? It should create component. Whenever you see this kind of stuff, you're creating something called a unit test. And then what you want to do, you can actually test to see that whatever you're creating is the stuff that you're getting out. Whatever you're asking for is what you're getting. If you've done any kind of unit testing, that's what this is all about. So do I need this right now? This app component spec.ts? Absolutely not. But you can use it for unit testing. All right, so that's what this part is. Favicon, they give you a default favicon. We've got an index.html. It's going to be a basic page, index.html. Notice it just includes things like a couple of meta tags for our Angular Quick Start and a bunch of script tags that need to be loaded in, right? Some of them are a shim, like I talked about. Remember we talked about shims? A zone.js file, right, to start you going. System.source.js file. All these systems.js.config.js, you need to have all of this in place in order for you to quick start, quote unquote, Angular, right? Hey, try and build this on your own. I challenge you, right? And make it all work together with the latest versions of Angular. I challenge you to do that too. And chances are, if you try and use the latest version of Angular's components, you'll have issues. You'll have some kind of zone error. And it's nothing to do with you. It's just because Angular 2 is still evolving, right? It's not wrong what they're doing here, but this is what they've kind of created a framework for you to start with. So here's a bunch of what it says, polyfills for older browsers, right? Because they want to have maximum compatibility, but these same polyfills cause, compatibility issues with modern browsers, which you'll see. Okay, so this is our manifest. I'm going through this. Main.ts, here's main.ts. Sometimes what we do is with main.ts, we put this main module, where we bootstrap app module. There's where we bootstrap it for the first time. We put this still inside of our app component, right? Our app folder. That's what we pretty much do. We're going to run this little thing. We're going to download it and run it together, and I'll show you how this all works, right? Then we have our styles.css. This is for the entire website, right? But again, I could put app, this styles.css stuff. I could put this inside of our app folder, which is probably the right thing to do. This, you should probably definitely, these two extras, if we have any extras, as well as systemjs.config.js, this one, we should definitely leave outside our source folder or in the source folder. tsconfig.json is our configuration file for TypeScript. Notice that it is way different than what we did last week. It uses module resolution node as well as source maps true. We do have something called emit decorator data that has to be on because you're using Angular. Any kind of Angular, even the old Angular required this, right, with TypeScript. Experimental decorators have to also be true. And this kind of worries me. Whenever I see any kind of experimental in a keyword, I'm always like, oh man, can they not, are they still working? But these are all the compiler options for TypeScript. So we're still targeting ECMAScript 5, notice, and we're still using CommonJS. Those are the kind of things we talked about last week, right? But we're, we have additional factors in here, so that way, for maximum compatibility and so that this whole project will work. Okay, so that's part of it. And that's all inside the source folder, right? Source folder. Then there's E2E. E2E. And do I need this E2E spec, right? And remember we talked about this is all unit testing. So I don't really need this folder at all. E2E, this part, I don't need it. It's nice to have, but I don't require it right now. Editor config, again, that's one thing. Git ignore, it gives you some basic things to ignore. So you don't want to put things like node modules up on GitHub and so on. That's what this thing is, and a bunch of other things. I'm going to keep going down here so you guys can see all of it. There's also bsconfig e2e JSON. So again, these are things that I can use for testing. And here's my Karma test gem that I use for unit testing JavaScript. And again, I don't really require all this. And they also talk about non-essential files for OS X and Windows. This is the key one here, and I want you to take a look at this one. Package.json. Remember package.json, what it was? It is our manifest for the entire Angular library. We'll take a look here. You have our scripts, right? So a bunch of build and watch and all this kind of stuff that you have. If I do builds, if I go npm start, which is typically what we would do, it would run something called concurrently, and it'll run a build with a watch function, right? And what we'll do is we'll start something called serve, right? And serve itself, these are all the scripts, will actually serve up light server, right? That looks familiar, which will automatically with browser sync. So browser sync will be on. So when I run Angular 2, it'll run the server and it'll give me browser sync, which will allow me to any changes that I make automatically will be displayed on the screen, which is kind of cool. These are all the dependencies. And if you notice the version 2.4.0, don't mess with these versions, man. Don't try and download your own, right? Because these versions are all slated to work together, right? So if you try and do this by yourself and kind of put this together, I highly recommend you don't. You will have errors that you cannot determine where they come from. And a lot of time it's because there's just incompatibility issues because they're traversing or they've been moved on to the latest version. So we're going to use this framework, and I'm going to show you how to build this thing up with Angular 2, and then we'll take a short break. All right, so tslint.json, one more thing. tslint.json is for TypeScript linting, right? So any kind of incorrect formatting or values or anything like that, trailing white spaces, semicolons in a different way, if you miss a semicolon or something, tslint or even jslint, any kind of linting, any linters help you with debugging, right? So it kind of catches errors ahead of time, especially syntax type errors. to help you so it prevents errors in the future. That's what this is all about. All right, so let's download this thing. And without further ado, please do this with me. I know that some of you may decide not to, and that's fine. But I'm going to download the zip file. I'm going to put it here on my desktop. So here's my desktop. And I've got my quick start master. Right, so we're going to go back to, and I got a little Angular demo just to fall back on, just in case, because I always try and prepare for worst case scenarios, like usually Angular. And I'm going to double click and export this stuff here. All right, extract, and here's my quick start master. Let's call it something else. Let's call it today's lesson, which I will start with, and we're going to modify this a little bit. It's COMP3025, and we're going to talk about winter 2017, and it's lesson 5. Right, that's what this thing is. Yay, we're fantastic. Let's pull up our Visual Studio Code like we normally do and drag and drop this little thing inside of there. Well, we got a quick start going on, right? By the way, if you notice these little icons, I just turned on the VS Icons option so you can see some nice little icons here. Make VS Code a little nicer. All right, cool. So we've got this end to end, right? And I'm going to take a look at index.html for a second, and I want to ask you the question. When I go into my source folder, my source folder has my app folder, right? This is where it is. And notice my index.html is inside of my source folder. Here it is, index.html. And notice I have my core and client and sims and config and all that stuff, but I don't have anything that really accesses my end-to-end, right? That's all done here in my E2E testing, or is what we're doing. And all that, and it's including Karma and everything else, that whole package is accessed through the package.json. So if I want to test something, I can just type in the command E2E, npm E2E, which will run protractor, which will allow me to test my installation. I can also run things like my test. I can run a test to see if we're running this thing properly. Do I need all this? Absolutely not. It's definitely not minimal. I don't know. I'm sure they want to, people at Angular are trying to make it nicer for you to set up testing framework and so on. But for beginners, it makes it so that our quick start is quite convoluted, right, in terms of all the testings. What I want you to do for now, as we preview this thing, is please ignore most of these commands. The one that we really need is npm start. Okay, if we don't use npm start, we can't get our project going. Okay, number 1. 2, let's do the following. Remember, let me go back to this as an example. And if I go open this up in a terminal window, so open up in terminal, here we are, or command prompt for you if you're a PC user, right? What you want to do, right, is you want to do the following. Inside this thing, because I have a bunch of modules that's in my package.json file. Here they are, dependencies. So there's dependencies, like we talked about before, and there's dev dependencies. Here's my dev dependencies. Dev dependencies are just for development. Notice that they have their own version of TypeScript installed. This is great if you're using a system that doesn't have TypeScript installed, or let's say, for example, you are up on Cloud 9 and you're using Cloud 9 as your development environment. What this does is it loads a version of TypeScript locally for your project, right, that matches the requirements of the project, not TypeScript globally, right? So my TypeScript globally is like 2.1 dot whatever it is, right? But TypeScript locally, they want you to put in a TypeScript version of 2.0. This is good from a compatibility perspective again, because remember, TypeScript is transpiling things from JavaScript or TypeScript to JavaScript, and it's specifically for this Angular project structure, right? Again, would you want to build this on your own? Hell no, right? But it's there for you, and let's leverage it, right? So I'm going to go back to terminal here, and I'm going to do an npm install, because this kind of involves me getting all the projects development dependencies in line right away, right? So once I've got this stuff going, I'll have everything that I need to get Angular going, and this will be all the node modules that we're going to go and fetch right now, and place into our module or into our project inside the node modules folder. That's what this is all in. And again, what we're doing also is, there's a lot of them. What we're doing is we're also not just getting Angular modules, but also type definitions, right? Here's the type definitions. Notice that these are part of them. And here's types. There's one type at types node, And we're getting the, the version of 6.046. That's the version of the type definition library for Node.js, right? So we get some help with that. And we also have types at types Jasmine. This is for testing. Oh man, where's at types Angular? That's bad. That means I'm not going to get Angular, code hinting, right? And I think that's one thing that we need to add in, right? So please, let's go to these folder again. And I know I talked about not messing around with this thing, but we need to do this one. So we're going to npm install at types Angular, right? And we want to try and do that as much as possible because, of course I didn't do it right. minus save minus dev is what I wanted to put in. Let's uninstall that for a second. This is going to put it as actually I won't put it in at all. We'll just put it in there as minus save minus dev to kind of install it as a development dependency. There we go. And now you can see that when we put anything in there as a development dependency there. There we go. Okay, and that's what happens. When actually this went through this just now, it went through and it looks at the two types that were down there, Jasmine and Node, and reorganized this dev dependencies list so that they're alphabetical. Where are the dev dependencies stored? These at types Angular. Well, they're inside of our Node modules, right? Notice that here's all the type definition libraries that we have here for Angular and Jasmine and jQuery and Node and all these other ones. And these type definition libraries give us code hinting. Okay, so if I go back to our source folder, inside of our app folder, inside of our app module, which is the main module where we're installing things like our app component and our browser and everything else. If I hover over things like this, I get type hinting, which is what I want. Totally want this stuff. And same thing with my app module itself. It tells me that this is a class, and I can add in any kind of things I want. One good thing with Angular and TypeScript is if I put in a directory that's incorrect, so let me just put something else in there like app.component, and I'll put in a .h, making this just a different kind of file, right? Notice it gives me an underline, right? It knows, and this is really cool from a linking perspective, it knows inherently that app.component-h, the way I've just messed with it, there's no path for this. It kind of doesn't find a module here. It looks for this deep linking that they have between modules and components. So if it's not a module, it's going to give you an underline, which is really, really cool. All right, cool. So let's kick this off and see what happens. How do I do that? If everything was working well, I'm going to go npm start, and npm start will run everything, and what we should have is hello Angular right here. Right, this is what you should get. Let's see what it actually injects. Let's see how this thing looks, right? So right click, I'm going to go into inspect, and I want to kind of look at a couple things. One, console. Do I get an error? Well, no, but I get something like Angular is running in development mode. Call enable prod mode to enable the production mode. Okay, that's one. Second thing is when I look at my elements, right, and if I look at my body, this is interesting. So here's my stuff that gets injected, right? So this is inside the body of my document. Here's the head of my document. So all these things that I loaded in. But I want to talk about what gets injected here. Okay, now notice here's my app ng version 2.4.6. Take a look. What's happening here? This h1 tag is being injected, right? But yet it appears as something that's inside of my HTML, right? And of course, it would do this. It takes this HTML and literally it does injection inside of my page. Cool. Let's do a couple of modifications to this thing. Number one, notice that this is running light-server, which means that any changes I make to my files automatically gets reboots the server. That's what it does. And it'll update my browser right away. One thing that I always like to change, by the way, notice how my components got translated from TypeScript to JavaScript. So here's a TypeScript version, right? This one that we see here. And here's the JavaScript translation, right? And as you can see, it's very, very ugly, right? But it's very ugly for a reason. This whole thing up here where it says __ decorate, right, is a shim for JavaScript to make it all work. It's kind of like a little minimized function that allows us to do this idea of a decorator for JavaScript. Okay, that's what this thing does, right? But if you look at it at its core, what I'm really creating is a prototype right? Because this is what's that's happening. A closure, here's my closure, my iffy, right? My immediately invoked function expression. And inside of that, in the JavaScript, I'm creating a closure function app module. An app module itself, what I'm saying is it equals to this decorate method, and I'm injecting inside of there anything that I'm importing, all my declarations, and any kind of bootstrapping I'm doing. All those are arrays of dependencies or things that I'm bootstrapping into my main module. Right? That's what these are. These are just an arrays of different things I want to inject. Okay, cool. App.component. I want to change this up to give you an idea of how this works. So if, let's say, for example, I say hello Angular, right? I want to try and do that. But instead of hello Angular, I want to go to the next line here. And notice with backtick I can. And I want to put in a paragraph. Here's my paragraph. And this is kind of tedious, isn't it? Where I have to actually put in all the HTML myself with no code hinting. Kind of tedious. I'll put a paragraph that says, this is my demo Angular 2, right? App. There we go. And I'll save this, which automatically transpiles everything. Notice that it's happening here. It's restarting the server, right? Where with this kind of stuff happening. And if I go back to this, I should have, there's my demo Angular 2 app. Automatically gets injected underneath the other one. So I can add in my template. What it does is it takes my HTML that I put in, smashes it inside of my code, and here we have our page, right? Now, why go through all this? That's the question. Why go through all this to do anything that I can normally do with HTML? It's organization is the reason. And the ability, it gives us a lot of scalability. That's another thing that Angular 2 and Angular in general gives us. As a front-end framework, it gives us scalability so we can create web applications and a front end using this whole idea of this model view controller paradigm, right? Actually, it's more closer to a model view model more than anything else nowadays. Okay, so let's go back. So I've got this. We know how to change that. I'm going to go back up here. And what I want to do is in my template, right? Here's my template. I want to take this away, this template right here. And this is an exercise for you guys to try. Here's my template. I want to get rid of this template. And I want to put it inside another file because it doesn't make sense to be put here. This is like inline. I could do it inline like this. And for the basics, this is OK. But what I really want to do is I want to make another file. And I want to call this a file app.component, right? And then .html, app.component.html. There we go. So in my app.component.html, I'm going to go back to my app.component. I'm going to rip this stuff out right here, all this part. So any kind of stuff we've done, kind of cut it out. And go to my app.component.html, right? So here it is in here. Just get to it and inject it. Now we get code hinting because, you know, VS Code detects this as HTML, right? And we're golden because once we've done this, we can, you know, write proper HTML. We can inject Bootstrap. We can do all kinds of stuff in here, right? And we get good code hinting that we wouldn't normally get inside this app component.ts. Here we go, app component.ts here. Now, in order for us to do that, we have to change template, the word template, to template URL, right? So if I go in here and start typing template, notice I get code hinting for Angular, and I want to use template URL. There it is. And once I've changed it to template URL, what I want to do is I want to kind of go back with the backticks and, you know, use a relative path, app, right, which is where this is going. And actually, it would be source app. We can try this different relative paths here. And inside app, we're going to go to app.component.html, right? That's where it's going to be. Now, I'm using source because I'm actually coming from the top. We may have to monkey with this a little bit to make it work, but you'll see how it works. So save. And if everything went well, right, and it didn't, you're going to see the stuff here. Now, this is what the error is, right? Notice how we get an error. And if we go into inspect, and if I go to console, it says failed to load resource. The server responded with status 404. Localhost source app.component HTML isn't found, right? You got to think about this. So this is correct for us because if I click on this thing, you're going to get cannot get source app component, right? We don't know what that is. Okay, let's try something else. Maybe could it, and by the way, this is the dreaded zone away zone aware error. If you get zone aware error, that means something's gone wrong. And if you kind of try and figure out what this does, it doesn't tell you a lot, but it tells you where the problem is. It says, fail to load source app component HTML. This is where you want to look at. This is the rejection. And it's kind of giving you a promise. You're trying to do something and you're returning something else. So this is incorrect. All right, so the path we put in was incorrect. Let's try another path. What if I put in app in here, right? Because it's relative. App and save. Does that fix it, right? And then we get blank. What the hell happened here? How come we're getting blank? Didn't give me an error, right? And loads, and it says we're supposed to load stuff, but yet in our app.html, it gets this stuff, right? So it didn't give us an error, but it also didn't load anything in, right? How come? Anybody have an idea? Anybody have a clue of why this is the case, right? Well, look, it says Angular is running call enable prod mode to go into project mode, but it doesn't really tell us any errors. We just kind of put this into a separate file to make it run. And in my app component.ts, you can see that I'm importing component. Now, question: do you think, right, that yes?
You didn't save the HTML file.
Oh yeah, right. If I don't save the HTML path, you mean this part, right?
Yeah, you didn't
Then it's going to be empty, and this is what's caused me an issue, and I'm just going to go troubleshoot that. But thank you for that. Hey, wonderful, right? Beautiful. We've got our stuff, and you want to compartmentalize like this. And by the way, it's going to be the exact same in Ionic. When we go back to Ionic, we look at that framework. You're going to see that wow, this is exactly what we want. We want this kind of functionality. We don't want to make it so that it is all the same inline file, because otherwise we're going to have issues, right? Okay, so here's this part. And again, we can add as much as I want. Well, what about CSS? So I want to change this. I want this as my demo Angular 2 app. I want this to be something else, right? I want this to be colored another color. Let's make it so that, how do I make it so that this is a different font, maybe a different size or whatever? Well, I need CSS. I need to be able to hook into this somehow. So we're going to kind of do, we're going to kind of inject a class, right? So class of, we'll call it description. Here's our description. So whenever we have a tag with a class of description, what I want to do is I want to change the font style, right, to a different font style. So first we describe the class here in HTML. The next thing is we need a CSS file, right? So let's do that. So we're going to go to new file, right? And we're going to do the same thing, app.component. Notice the nomenclature. .css. Here's our CSS. Inside here, we can put any CSS we want, and we want to target class of description. Anything with a class of description, what we want to say is that we want our font dash style or font that's weight. We'll make font weight. Right, here's my font weight. We'll make it bold, right? Yay, which is the same as 700. Okay, cool. So we've got this done, but we're not using this little style we just put in, right? This little style we're using. And this is our custom style. We can put any kind of comments you want in here as well, like normal, the CSS file. Custom style. Oh man, how come I'm getting this? I'm getting this really weird error because CSS doesn't use that kind of commenting style. It uses this one, Tom, right? Yay, everything's fantastic. But now we have to inject it into our app.component. So here's our app component. Yay. We've got our template URL. And notice we've got this little extra comma, which should have given us an error, but didn't. And I want to try and start typing styles. There's two different ways we can do this. Styles, right, inline with an array of styles, or style URLs. This is neat, right? Here's our style URLs, which is equal to an array of styles, starting with our first one. Well, we can do the same thing, app/app.component, right, .css, right? So there it is. Save. And if we did things properly, then you're going to see a bolded version of my description, right? So how do we do that? Selector, template URL, style URLs. And the style URLs indicate more than one. We can have more than one style URL that we want. So we have more than one CSS file linked to each of the pages, which is beautiful. That means we have a lot of control. We can break out our CSS into different parts to make it more readable. Remember, CSS is one of the most challenging for developers to kind of consume. They look at it and they go, what the hell is this CSS? It doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because it's completely disorganized for most people. But you can also use things like SCSS if you want to use Sass, so more of an evolved version of CSS if you want to, and multiple files, which is cool. So that doesn't take a lot, right? I mean, you have what? Your app component CSS, app component HTML, your app component.js, you have your app component.ts. These are all fantastic good things. And that's how we group things together, right? So we do them all inside the app folder. If I wanted some other functionality, right, instead of my app folder, I could include it in another folder, right? And that would be a bunch of other components for that functionality, right? So different functionality, you're going to split off into different folders. To me, guys, this is the easiest part of Angular 2. The idea that each component describes the class and everything else. Here in the classes definition, that's even easier for the classes, right? Remember we talked about last week with TypeScript? Well, the fantastic thing about this is you can add any kind of properties you want to hook into, right? So now we have name is Angular. As an example, you can have other properties in there that kind of hook into data. And this class is just like a TypeScript class. It is a TypeScript class. It has all the features of a TypeScript class. And this itself, this module that we're in right now, has all the features of a module, which means they all link in properly. All right. Let's get back to that walkthrough for a second, and then we'll take a short break. So when you look at the quick start, right, it kind of does give us a way of move it, right? It does do that for us. It allows us to, we downloaded this quick start seed, and then what it does is, it says the quick start seed live example is quick start plus the app module and main TS application files described below. Now, if you want to do things from scratch, it talks about how to do this from scratch. It says, create a project folder, clone or download the quick start seed, and install npm package. We did all this kind of stuff, and they talk about this. Download the quick start seed from, and unzip it. That's the other option, right? You can delete non-essential files, right? So example things like, do this in the beginning. It says, to remove things that you don't need, right? And one of the things we don't need for sure is all the testing, right? All the testing. And they kind of give you an outline of what your basic folder looks like, right? So that you don't start from scratch. You don't need to start from scratch. But you need these folders. These primary folders to start any kind of Angular 2 application are required, all right? Okay. And it says all guides in QuickBooks have at least these 3 core files, which is totally true. If you actually look online, you should see all those kind of things. They describe them in detail. Talk about what this is all around, right? Next step, if you're new to Angular, we recommend staying on the learning path. We're going to stay on the learning path because if we don't stay on the learning path, we're kind of in trouble, right? We've done our setup, right? And after our setup, we can do our Tour of Heroes tutorial. I recommend, again, you do that kind of stuff as well. And what it does is it talks about what the Tour of Heroes is going to look like, where you have a dashboard, and there's the heroes, and then different kinds of heroes, Narco, Bombasto, Celeritas, and Magneta, right? Different kinds of heroes, superheroes, obviously. And then there's 2 links, dashboard and heroes, and it says we can link them together, navigate between the dashboard and the heroes view. And this is what the details are for Magneta. By the way, this is very close to what I'm going to get you guys to do with assignment number 2, right? Just FYI. So that's what I'm telling you, because you're building something that's like this, right? And here's Tour of Heroes, right? Mr. Nice, Narco, Bombasto, a bunch of different kind of guys that you can add in. And they're kind of showing you here what they want to create, right? So here's our main page. I love the way they've done this. And I have to be honest with you, they've done a lot of things right here with Angular 2, the Google team, right? This is one of the things they've done right. Okay, so you've got your idea of where it's going to go. You click on Magneto or any kind of hero. It gives you the hero details. Here they are, right? You click the back button, takes you back here, right? If you click on the heroes, all the heroes, you see all the heroes, the tour of all the heroes, where you can actually quickly go from one to the other. If I go back to view details, right, where Magneta is my hero, I go back to here, right? It's a really interesting little dashboard of stuff that you can get to with a little bit of data. And that's what we're going to be building. One of the things we're talking about here, when you see how they're actually giving you a live click-through to give you an idea of what it looks like. So heroes, this is also very good from a tutorialization perspective. God, I wish most games we play have this kind of thing. All right. Sometimes our games aren't even kind of as descriptive, although they should be these days for the 12 million and 15 million and 100 million they spend on making AAA games these days. Damn, making AAA games and even applications like this sometimes costs as much as making movies, right? So example of this would be, here we go. So he's clicking on Mrs. Fantastic, clicking on heroes, Miss Fantastic, and then my hero, view details, and then you're going to get to the details screen where you can go to the dashboard again. It's all linked together. Let me just look at this one more time, right? Heroes, dashboard, go either back or forth. Narco, notice if you change the name from Narco to something else, immediately you get this change to Miss Fantastic. And when you've done this, this is called two-way data binding, this idea of automatically updating our data as we go without having to access the database and do kind of a refresh of the screen. That's the power of Angular 2. That's what we kind of inherited that from Angular 1. And this is what our application is going to do. Up next, right? We'll build this tour of heroes step by step. And we're doing the walkthrough because we need to learn Angular and the hero editor. All right, now this is interesting. So it talks about before we get to this, right? And this is the lab 2 that you're going to get today, right? Lab 2, for the people who are interested in doing and to hand it in today, right? I want you to step through in today's class, tour of heroes, right? I want you to create tour of heroes. I'm going to make you guys do work, actually, right? And pay. And for those people that are here in the class, if you want to get your 2% bonus, go through the walkthrough with Angular 2. Finish your tour of heroes. Make it work. Take a screenshot. Or actually, the best place is put it up on GitHub. This is better, right? Put it up on GitHub. Create your, your project files, right? Zip up your project files and give them to me and hand them in. Please do not, it would be very terrible for you to do this. Please do not download the completed thing on your own. And for the reason why I'm going to put it out there to you, to make it customized so it's not just yours, and not just doesn't look like Tour of Heroes. I want you to customize the interface and change the color schemes to make it your own, all right? And I want you to inject your own logo in there. It's going to take you 10 minutes to do something like this, okay? You have the class to do it, right? This is the exercise for today because we need to learn Angular 2. And then what we'll do is we'll recap near the end of the class, and I want to see what you've got. You upload this by the end of the class, lab 2, right, for 2% bonus, okay? So please do the walkthrough. I want a couple of unique things, a logo of your own on the actual site so we know it's you, right, that you didn't just steal this from the completed version, right? And the other thing is I want to change the color scheme. So change the colors, don't keep the Tour of Heroes standard colors, make your own, go through the color palette and all that kind of stuff. There is no bonus to the bonus, okay? So if you do extra work, I'm not going to give you bonus on top of bonus. That doesn't make any sense. It's like, that's like a mosquito bite on top of a pimple. I don't know where I thought about that. It's really painful, okay, is what I'm saying, right? So please, I'm not going to give you extra bonus on top of the bonus. Just do what I've asked you, do your Tour of Heroes. If you're someone who's working remotely, Anthony, and not you, you've already done this kind of stuff, I know it's going to be painful to go through this, but it's part of this thing for 2% bonus. Please do this kind of stuff. And then everyone will be online. If you're someone who, and again, someone says, well, Tom, do I have to do it within class time? Yes, you have to do it within class time. Let's do today. You've got, we're sitting at 9, it means you get 2 hours to putz around with Angular 2, to get really comfortable with it. And then you'll have a chance to, next week when we hit Ionic 2, because we're going to, remember, on the exam, you're going to be talking about TypeScript. We're going to talk about Angular 2. We're going to be talking about Ionic. If you don't have practice if I don't give you practice on Angular 2, right, then the exam is going to be really hard, right? I don't want to make it. I want to make it easy as the easiest exam you've ever done, all right? Because we're only going to have one midterm, and that's it. All right, so without further ado, I'll let you to it. I'm going to put up the specs for Lab 2 shortly, but let's take a short break. We'll take 10 minutes here in class. Again, from a broadcast perspective at this point, I'm going to hold off. I'm not going to do any more for today. There's nothing else to really talk about except for your assignment. And if I do broadcast anything, it'll be near the end where I'll be talking about your assignment details. And there'll be things you've seen before. Nothing new from an assignment perspective. Assignment deal will be due in a couple weeks. We're sitting at week 5, which means on near exam day, it'll be due. Assignment 2, it'll be worth 15% of your final mark. And that's what I'll be talking about when we come back from break. But I won't do it right away. I'll wait for you guys to start doing your lab, and I'll do the broadcast just before the end of class. Okay? Thanks very much. People who are watching, bear with me and tune in again half an hour before the end of class for the assignment 2 details.